blind date walked out laughing, until her father saw the single dad and saluted him. The restaurant went silent. Colonel Robert Carter slowly stood up, his back straight. His eyes locked on the man across the room. "Staff Sergeant James Harrison," he said firmly. James froze. Then, without hesitation, he rose to his feet and snapped into a perfect salute. Melissa's laughter died instantly. "Dad, what are you doing?" she whispered. 15 minutes earlier, she had walked out on this same man, laughing, dismissing him as a broke, scarred single dad not worth her time. Now she watched her father, a decorated U.S. Army colonel, return a salute with unmistakable respect. And in that moment, Melissa realized she hadn't just misjudged a date. She had walked away from a man her father recognized as a hero. James Harrison sat alone at the corner table long after M. The waiter came by twice, asking gently if he wanted to order. James shook his head both times. He wasn't hungry anymore. The half-full glass of water in front of him reflected the dim restaurant lights, rippling slightly as his hand trembled when he reached for it. He told himself it was nothing, just another awkward date, another polite rejection dressed up as a work emergency. He'd learned not to take these things personally. Or at least, he'd learned how to pretend. Still, something about the way Melissa laughed as she walked away stayed with him. It wasn't cruel out loud, but it wasn't kind either. It was the laugh of someone relieved to escape what she saw as a mistake. A laugh that said, "I'm better than this." James stared at the tablecloth, his jaw tightening. He thought of Sophie at home, probably already in bed, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. He'd told her he was just meeting a friend. He hadn't promised anything. But hope had a way of sneaking in anyway. Then he heard footsteps stop beside his table. When James looked up, he saw a man standing tall, shoulders squared, eyes sharp despite the gray at his temples. The man didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He simply looked at James with a kind of recognition that made something old and instinctive snap into place inside him. Before James even thought about it, he stood. "Staff Sergeant James Harrison," the man said, his voice calm but commanding. "Yes, sir," James replied automatically. The restaurant seemed to fade away as the man raised his hand and rendered a formal salute. James returned it without hesitation, pain flaring briefly through his shoulder as muscle memory took over. Across the room, Melissa stood frozen. She had followed her father without thinking, still half smiling from her private amusement, until she saw the look on his face. This wasn't the polite nod her father gave waiters. This wasn't the casual acknowledgement he gave acquaintances. This was respect. Deep, unguarded respect. Colonel Robert Carter lowered his hand slowly. "I remember you," he said. "Bethesda. 2015. James swallowed. "Yes, sir. You saved 3 men that day," the colonel continued, his voice steady. "You stayed conscious when you had no business doing so. You refused evacuation until every one of them was accounted for." The words hit Melissa like physical blows. This wasn't some embellished war story. This wasn't resume padding. Her father didn't speak like this unless he was certain. Unless the facts were burned into his memory. James shifted uncomfortably. "I did what anyone in my position would have done, sir." Colonel Carter's eyes hardened slightly. "No," he said. "You did what not everyone is capable of doing." Silence settled heavy around them. Nearby diners pretended not to stare, failing badly. Then the colonel turned. "Melissa." She flinched at the sound of her name. "Explain," he said. Her mouth opened but nothing came out. She felt suddenly exposed, standing there in her perfect dress, her perfect makeup, her carefully constructed image cracking under the weight of the moment. There was a work issue," she said weakly. Her father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "An issue important enough to leave your date alone," he said, "but not important enough to stop you from laughing as you walked away." Melissa felt heat rush to her face. The satisfaction she'd felt minutes earlier evaporated, replaced by something sharp and ugly. James looked away. He hadn't intended to be the center of anything. He never did. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said quietly. "You didn't," Colonel Carter replied. Then pointedly, "But my daughter did." That was the moment it truly sank in for Melissa. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was consequence. Her father, who had spent her entire life teaching her about honor, sacrifice, and character, was seeing her not as a successful executive, not as a polished adult, but as someone who had failed a basic test of decency. "Sit down," Colonel Carter said. It wasn't a request. Melissa sat. James hesitated, then followed. For the first time that night, Melissa really looked at him. Not at the worn blazer or the scar or the stiffness in his movements, but at the way he carried himself even now, even under scrutiny. There was no resentment in his eyes. No bitterness. Just a quiet dignity that made her chest tighten uncomfortably. "I judged you," she said finally, her voice low. "I didn't know anything about you and I assumed everything." James met her gaze. That tends to happen. There was no accusation in his tone. That somehow made it worse. Colonel Carter watched her closely. "What do you think character is, Melissa?" he asked. She swallowed. "I thought it was success, confidence, drive. And now," he pressed. She glanced at James. "Now I think it's what someone does when no one is watching." Her father nodded once. "Good. You're learning." But learning didn't erase consequences. Over the next few days, word traveled faster than Melissa expected. Emma, the counselor who'd set them up, heard what happened. From the waiter, from another teacher, from James himself when she cornered him in the hallway and demanded to know why he hadn't said anything about his past. "I didn't think it mattered," James said simply. Emma looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "You deserved better than that." Melissa felt the fallout everywhere. At work, her confidence faltered. For the first time, she questioned whether the image she projected was costing her more than it gave. At home, her father was distant. Not angry, but disappointed in a way that lingered. The worst part wasn't being judged. It was realizing she deserved it. When she finally reached out to James again, she didn't expect him to answer. But he did. They met again at the same restaurant. Not because it was romantic, but because unfinished things rarely resolve themselves elsewhere. This time Melissa arrived early. No strategic delay. No dramatic entrance. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said as soon as he sat down. "I just needed to say that I was wrong." James studied her for a long moment. "I'm not interested in punishing you," he said. "Life already does that well enough." That honesty was the final blow to her pride. And it was also the beginning of something real. Melissa didn't change overnight. But she changed deliberately. He showed up. She listened. She learned what it meant to be part of someone else's life. Especially a little girl who measured people not by resumes, but by who kept their promises. And the version of Melissa who once laughed and walked away. She paid for that arrogance every day she worked to be better. Because the real punishment wasn't humiliation in a restaurant. It was the slow, humbling process of realizing how close she'd come to losing something priceless, and knowing she'd had no one to blame but herself. Later that night, as the restaurant lights dimmed and conversations softened into background noise, James stepped outside to wait for his ride. The air was cool, carrying the quiet hum of the city. He rolled his shoulders gently, easing the familiar ache. And for the first time that evening, he allowed himself a small, genuine breath of relief. Inside, Melissa remained at the table, staring at her untouched glass. Nothing dramatic had happened. No shouting. No public spectacle. Just a moment that stripped away everything she thought defined her, and left behind something more honest. She didn't feel smaller. She felt clearer. From that night on, things didn't magically become easy. But they became real. Melissa learned to pause before judging. James learned that walking away with dignity could be its own kind of victory. And somewhere between quiet conversations and unspoken understanding, both discovered that truth doesn't need to announce itself loudly to change a life. As James glanced back through the window one last time, he caught sight of Colonel Carter seated calmly, hands folded, watching the room with steady eyes. No words passed between them. None were needed. Some lessons arrived gently. Others arrive disguised as discomfort. But the ones that matter most leave us standing straighter than before. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and share it. And if you believe in stories about growth, resilience, and second chances, help Canada's Heartfelt Tales grow by subscribing. Your support keeps these moments alive, and the next story closer than you think.